So now that the materials are set up and it's all looking good in UE4, and I can work on it properly with nice kind of live feedback, then I think it's time to really push the design of the vehicle towards finished. Once I've kind of finished the overall design of the vehicle and I'm happy with it, then I'll obviously need to go in and wrap up all of the bodywork, which means doing all of those small bevels and forcing all of their normals. And then I also need to go in and wrap up all of the high poly elements ready for baking for all of the baked components that we'll have on it, like the gun, these air brakes I'm looking at the moment, and like the afterburner and things like that. And then once we've kind of finished wrapping up that modeling, then we can move into the process of kind of preparing all of the components to be baked, baking those down, fixing up all of the UVs for the whole asset so they're not temporary, and then optimizing it down a little bit, and then really putting together all of those final bakes into shaders in UE4 for the finished asset. So at the moment, all I'm doing is I'm taking elements of the design that I feel are still very block out and just kind of wrapping those up. So now I'm thinking about how will these air brakes actually move? How will they need to pivot from the vehicle in order to flare out and help to slow down the vehicle, or sort of to pull in towards the afterburner and help to kind of like direct the sort of flow of energy out of the afterburner in the direction that we actually want it to go. And while I do this, I also need to think about how these would actually pivot from the vehicle, because I don't want it to have these very kind of flimsy connections like it does at the moment, because then it looks like it could very easily just snap off if they tried to air brake the vehicle at 400 or 500 miles an hour. So I'm not thinking that these are the only method of braking for the vehicle. I'm just thinking that these will help alongside the side boosters to help with the overall directionality of the vehicle. And what I'm doing at the moment is making these pieces look like they're sort of CNC machined. So there's lots of kind of diagonal, roughly 30-degree angles in the way that they're formed in a metal shop. So that's in order to keep structural integrity of the shape, but also to reduce the weight of it to a kind of a bare minimum, whilst not making it kind of weaker. So that's sort of like why I'm from below and from the underside, I'm kind of hoping that will help to bring a level of interest around the afterburner, because I want this area to look nice. And then from the top, then I want to kind of keep them quite flat and not super distracting, because I want, from when you're looking at the vehicle from the front, I want you to kind of focus more on the side boosters and also on the gun and the camera, so maybe not on these kind of air brakes. But when you're around the back of the vehicle, then I want it to look more like you really want to focus on the underside of the boosters, this big afterburner, and also on these air brakes, which is why it's quite a high level of detail on the bottom of them and not a huge amount on top. Because also I imagine that the amount of friction that would build up on the top of these as the vehicle flies forward would also potentially cause them to be ripped off the vehicle, maybe need them to be much thicker. So I'm imagining they would need to be quite smooth and aerodynamic on the top surface. And now I'm just trying to think about what kind of shapes do I need to build into this space on the vehicle to really allow for these flaps to kind of like pivot from. So it can look like quite a kind of a solid heavy duty housing, which is there to kind of be battered by storms and airflow and wind, but also be able to kind of hold the integrity of these air brakes. And I'm trying to kind of model them in a way that they look like they're quite sort of solid, but also so that they don't need to be baked. I don't want to, because it's not an element that I want to spend a lot of resources on. I want to model it in a way where it's simple enough that I can get the basic shape right, make sure I feel happy with it, maybe do some preview renders, look at it in UE4, and then once I feel like it does the job that it needs to do, but it's also not grabbing the eye too much, then I can go through and just add those very small bevels to it, do the normal mid-poly workflow to it, and get that into the overall design of the vehicle. So it's only slightly kind of affecting the silhouette, just to make this area a little more interesting, but also not so interesting that it's really kind of like drawing the eye and becoming a big story piece, because that's not what I want at all. I also need to kind of be aware that as I do this, I need to allow for the kind of outtake on the back to sort of like pump out hot air, and also for that hot air not to hit the air brakes and generate some sort of thermal that might affect the trajectory of the vehicle, and just kind of make it difficult for the air brakes to kind of do their job if the heat's building up in that area. So all I'm doing is continuing to sort of refine the shape to make sure that it works nicely with the overall curves of the vehicle. So here I'm sort of making sure that this fits well with that panel, because I'm imagining that the back section of the tail might rotate down when the vehicle tips downwards. So it'd want to be able to rotate around this piece quite easily. And again here I'm thinking this is maybe some sort of bracket where the piece just connects to the rest of the vehicle. I could even push it a bit further and have bolt decals there to make it look like it is a bracket with different connections. But I'm not too worried about building up the noise in this area, so I'm going to keep it quite simple because I don't want it to draw the eye too much. So now I'm just checking it out in UE4, see if I like the overall shape of it. It's got to look interesting, but without sort of being too distracting. So now I want to make it look like the panel on the bottom is semi-integrated into the actual shape of the air brakes. So you can see that the air brakes has this kind of hinge that they hinge off of. So what I want to do is just create these sort of struts that look similar in design to the hinge, so that at least they look like they were designed at the same time, and that it's not just two shapes just kind of shoved together. And although it looks a little bit hacky in Modo, when I do it in UE4 it looks pretty good. I think because the base materials that I will use on both elements will be the same. The only difference will be that one will have a baked normal map and the other one won't. So I'm just going through, cutting the faces, beveling those, and then extruding them out. And then once I'm happy with this, then I just double check it again quickly in UE4 to see if I'm happy with the result. And then I can get to work on kind of just creating the actual bevels on this whole piece, do my force normals, and then I'm good to go. So I'm kind of imagining that if these areas don't look like they have a lot of depth to them, then how will they look once I have my AO baked into the whole vehicle? So I'm not too worried if they're lost a little bit in the viewport at the moment, because I know that I'll get the benefit of that AO at some point. So now, as I said, all I'm doing is I'm going through adding my kind of nice tight bevels to make it look like a finished piece. And then when I'm happy with my bevels, then I will use my force normal script just to force the bigger faces to be flat, and then the bevels will look like nice kind of rounded edges. And sometimes what I like to do is to avoid fully 90-degree perpendicular angles. I'll maybe kind of adjust it so it's sort of 75 degrees or something like that, and it means that when you're looking at the shape, then you've just got bigger glancing angles to see kind of the design. So that's why on the bottom those struts aren't quite 90-degree blocks, they are sort of like slightly tapered in, and it just means it just gives it larger faces and more kind of like I guess just a larger space for the faces to catch light when we're moving around the vehicle, just to really kind of like help to emphasize what they're there for. And then when I combine that with the AO, then it will help to just make them look quite visible. So quite often in video game assets like this, I will just sort of exaggerate the bevels, exaggerate the general faces, like the size of the faces and the size of the shapes, because you do have to compete with aliasing and lodding as you move away from the vehicle. And then in some cases I will triangulate my faces because I want to know exactly how it's going to triangulate before it goes to UE4. I don't want to risk a face triangulating in the opposite direction to what I'm planning and having a kind of a nasty result. So you can see here that I'm happy with the actual bracket and how it connects now. So then with the addition of a bit of AO, then I think that will give me the result I want. So now I'm thinking I'll go through and I'll just flesh out these actual hinges, because while I've been looking at the design of the how this piece connects to the vehicle, then I've obviously been sort of looking at this piece here and thinking this doesn't look finished. So now I can come through and just continue to use the ideas I was thinking about. These elements that I'm doing at the moment may be kind of baked down to the final asset. So I'm just thinking I'm stepping back and forth between high poly, force normals, mid poly kind of workflows. So at the moment, this piece I'm working on, I'm thinking this stuff is going to be baked. So this is me doing my high poly work. And then the piece I was doing just now is just mid poly, because that bracket that we just plugged this into is basically ready to go. So right now I'm thinking, okay, how do I push this to look like something that will look nice in a final render, so it's ready for me to bake down? And then all I'll do is I'll create a slightly cheaper version when I'm ready to. But you can see that because I'm not using control loops and I'm not manually beveling all of my edges, I'm not having to go into this later and spend a decent amount of time generating a low poly. It will be very fast. So I'm just going through now, kind of cleaning up the topology to make sure it bakes well. And you'll notice again that with this, on this piece, when I create a lot of the shapes, I don't always make them 90-degree perpendicular shapes. I do kind of tend to taper the sides of the design in a little bit, because I do think it will bake better into the normal map as well. It will give it more information for the normal map to actually play with, and then those details will be easier to read from a distance. So now as I move around the vehicle, because my whole process is super iterative, I'm still able to say, okay, I need to adjust where the jet engine is, or adjust where the boosters are, and just little annoyances I'm free to change at any point, because I'm not kind of tied into where these pieces are and I'm not settled on them. So all the way until the end of the process, I can still easily add a third booster on the side or move the jet engine around, because these pieces will be baked individually and then instanced around, so it's easy to move the instances. And also all of the mid-poly work allows for me to just continue to model into it. And like I've mentioned before, the most time-consuming part of doing that would normally be to break the UVs and do all of my bakes again. But because my bakes will only be AOs, so they'll only take a couple of minutes, and my UVs are basically very quickly kind of like auto-packed UVs, then it also means that it doesn't take me very long to quickly do all of my re-UVing, pack that, and then continue on. So you can see here that all I'm doing is just continuing to just sort of generally refine the actual design of the drone. So here I'm thinking that I need to bed this grid into this face better than I have now. So I'm thinking I just need to add a very, very simple frame here that will allow it to look like it's actually there to kind of hold this vent in place, as opposed to just shoving those faces into each other in a clumsy way, because then I think that helps to make it look especially gamey. So all I've done is deleted the faces you can't see, and then I've just added a small bevel, done my force normals, and then that piece is finished. Like it's very, very simple. And then I'll just make sure it's quickly UV'd, scaled to the right resolution, and I can look at it in game and just see if it's doing the job I want. And then again, I'm imagining that once I've added my AO, then it'll give it that depth that I need. So because I've just been working on the vent at the front, it's reminded me that I needed to add a vent at the back. So I've just copied that face, and then I've extruded it in order to cap the vent. And then I've copy pasted the face, applied the vent material to it, and now I'm scaling it just so it looks nicer, like it's a nicer level of noise in that area. And what I want it to do is make it look like the jet is going deep into the body of the vehicle, and also it allows for air to move around the jet so that it's not just building up heat in that area. And it's just a nice way of me wanting to add a little bit more noise and complexity around the jet engine, because I do want it to be an interesting component. So again, here I'm sort of thinking the same thing. I need to move these areas just out of the way of my Stuart platforms to make sure that they can rotate well. And I'm just generally going through and kind of refining these shapes. So just sort of anything to kind of like add a little bit more interest to the silhouette. And then at some point I can say, okay, yeah, no, I'm happy with this shape. So I can go through and do my bevels and my force normals. So I'm just trying to stop it from kind of looking samey. So I'm thinking if I add a little bit more bulk to the front of this thing, then it breaks up those long straight lines. Just gives it a little bit more visual interest. Because one thing I don't want to do is spend time making this really, really nice kind of drone design that has lots of silhouette, and then one area in the middle I've just sort of lost interest and allowed it to become quite boring. And then I think that can really kind of pull down the aesthetic of the whole thing if it's not well thought about. So even though I'm not putting a lot of modeling time and a lot of complexity into the space, I do want to make sure that it feels like it's at least adding some sort of sense to the design. So I'm sort of thinking by being bulky towards the front, then it's sort of helping to aid the overall feeling that this whole vehicle is heavier and bulkier towards the front of the vehicle, and then lighter and more agile towards the back. So I guess at that point then I feel like I'm quite happy with that shape. So I'm probably starting to get kind of a bit more like I want to push the boosters on the sides more towards the finished piece, so that I can really see if they're doing the job, or if they need a little bit more love, or maybe if they need to be high polyed for UE4. So I'm just going through now and seeing how difficult it would be for me to add my bevels and do the face weighted normals for them without breaking the shading around the cylinder, because obviously it can be very difficult to model straight into a cylinder. So this is me kind of going through and testing that this is definitely safe for me to do. And if it's not, then I would need to come through, create a proper high poly, bake down to a low poly. But I don't want to do that because this element is quite large. So it would use a lot of it would use a lot of texture space if I was to bake a normal map. And I don't want this asset to become super expensive. It's good that it's modular and it's distanced, but it's still quite a large piece. And also it doesn't benefit in a huge way from having a normal map. So that's why I'm going through now, doing all of my bevels and just ensuring that this is safe for me to continue on like this. So I'm simply going around beveling those edges and then tightening up all of these kind of unwanted edges and unwanted vertexes in order to keep my overall shading feeling quite nice. And then on these inner edges, because they're not as important and I don't want to waste polys, then I leave those to be quite hard because they're just creating silhouette at that point. So I don't want to waste any poly count there. Because doing this workflow does add to the poly count quite quickly. So where you're saving in texture maps, like normal maps and baked AO and stuff like that for it, then you are paying for in extra polygons. So if your engine struggles to render in polygons and is fine with textures and texture memory and seeking those in, then for you it could definitely be more worthwhile to actually model a high poly and a low poly and bake it down. But for me, I can see that UE4 will handle the poly count of this drone completely fine. So this is obviously how I like to work. And this is also just much more iterative, and it makes it way more interesting for me to work on my design in a mid-poly workflow than trying to think, Now I'm finally happy with the overall design and the high poly looks cool. Now I have to do a whole low poly, UV the low poly so that my textures look okay, and then go through and maybe in Substance Designer or Mari or something, go through and do a whole paint job. I just want to be able to spend my time on my design, making sure that looks cool. And if I can do that in a mid-poly fashion, then I know that it's very close to the final asset that I can put in. And then I can just bake those components, tile my textures that I built in Ddo, and then I sort of have a finished piece. Maybe I can go in and add some extra masking in order to add detail and really refine that. But you can see that as I move around, I'm quite happy with the force normals here. I feel like they're doing the job that they need to do. And this piece on the side it doesn't need to be super interesting because it's just a connection. So I'm just going around, bevel these faces, edges, force my normals. Then I just quickly UV it and then make sure that the material looks decent on it. And then I know that later it's going to have probably a little bit of grime on it, which will come from the AO, some actual AO, which will give it a bit of depth. And then it'll probably have a little bit of scratch on it because I'm going to render out a quick edge mask that will define where my scratches go. So things like that will help to add definition to these pieces that aren't super interesting. So I'm just making sure that these line up well with my actual pivots. So now I'm feeling like my overall design is looking good, and I've tackled the pieces that were bothering me, like how these connections work and can I get away with just mid-polying the thrusters on the side. So from this point, what I need to do is move on to actually refining all of the components, all of these small pieces that I want to bake. So I'll go through, finish those off, and I'll be using the round edge shader to handle all of my tight bevels. And then after that, I'll move on to setting up my bakes.